All right, thank you everyone, and welcome to this presentation as part of the RDCA DAP webinar series. Today, the presentation is entitled "Using Ontologies to Standardize Rare Disease Data Collection" by Nicole Vasilevsky of the Monarch Initiative. Next slide, please. Before I introduce Nicole, I'll just go over a few of the operational procedures for this webinar and introduce myself. I am Ramona Walls. I'm the Acting Executive Director for Data Science at the Critical Path Institute. Again, welcome to this third webinar in our 2022 series. Please be sure to place all of your questions in the Q&A chat box that should be available at the bottom of your screen. There will be a Q&A session at the end of the presentation, so some questions may be answered in writing during the presentation, but if they're not addressed then, we will answer them during the Q&A session, and if we can't get to them during the Q&A session, we will be following up via email. In the Q&A box, please be sure that your questions are being sent to all panelists to make sure that they will be seen. And finally, this presentation will be recorded and made available to the public shortly after this presentation. Next slide, please. It is my great pleasure to introduce Nicole Vasilevsky. Nicole has a ton of experience working with ontologies, with FAIR data principles, with standardization, with scientific data, etc. Her research focuses on the development application of semantic technologies to facilitate knowledge discovery and promote scientific reproducibility. She's developed a bunch of different, she has contributed to and developed a number of different biomedical ontologies and data standards around the areas of phenotypes, diseases, and other biomedical domains. And we, with that goal really of that many of us in the ontology world share, promoting disease, improved outcomes for patients and improving diagnosis. She has extensive experience working collaboratively in a number of different projects, including with the Critical Path Institute as part of our ontology development here for RDCA DAP. She has made significant contributions in scientific reproducibility by demonstrating that the lack of uniquely identifying information in methods sections of publications, as well as in understanding and evaluating the current journal sharing policies, which, as we all know, usually have some room for improvement. So she has also contributed to clinical and translational impact through the development of making data more accessible to lay people. So I hope that work is going to come through very clearly in today's presentation. She's contributed extensively to standards around phenotypes and diseases through work with groups like the GA4GH, the OBO Foundry, and others. And she is currently at the University of Colorado Anschutz Medical Campus, working as part of the Monarch Initiative, which I'm sure she will tell us more about in her presentation today. So with that, we're going to stop sharing and let Nicole take over and share her slides. Oh, you're muted, Nicole.
Thanks for that introduction. Sure. Let me share my slides.
We see your slides, but there we go. Now it's in presenter mode. Perfect.
Perfect. Okay, yeah, thanks. So I'm going to talk today about using ontologies to standardize rare disease data collection. So in the past webinar on this topic, Ramona talked about why you should care about ontologies and how structuring data using ontologies can help with aggregating disparate and heterogeneous information about rare diseases. And this allows for a comparison of genotypic and phenotypic variations across diseases and informs treatments. So I'm going to give you an overview of the work that we've done with the Monarch Initiative today, first starting with an overview of biomedical ontologies, and then I'm going to give you some examples from our work that we've done with how we can use ontologies to standardize and integrate data, and some of the downstream analyses that we've done in our group, and hopefully these are things that can apply to the work that you're doing. And then talk about why you should contribute to ontology development efforts and why it's important to have a community involvement. And then I'm going to give you some explanation on how you can contribute to ontologies. And as well, I've created a webpage with some documentation at this link at tislab.org/ontology contributor. And this contains information on how you can contribute to ontologies. So this is available for you after this webinar if you'd like to be part of the community. And I'll talk about different ways that you can be involved. And this is just a kind of a how-to guide for your future reference. So first I'm going to start with giving an overview of biomedical ontologies, and first starting kind of with the problem. So in the case of rare diseases, the majority of patients have an underlying genetic variation that contributes to the pathophysiology of the disease. And there are many considerations that come into play. So looking at things like exome and genome sequencing, looking at phenotypes, socioeconomic factors, environmental exposures. There's a lot of data that can be captured about rare disease patients, but because all this data is so dispersed and some of the prevailing pipelines are not able to leverage all this data, many rare disease patients have a difficult time getting diagnosed, and sometimes it can take years. So some of the work that we do is to leverage all the available data that can be used for informing diagnoses and to help standardize it, because a lot of this data is a lot of the data about these different aspects of diseases is disparate, diverse, and heterogeneous, and not standard in any kind of way that makes it difficult to integrate and then compare data between patients or even look at data within patients. So we use ontologies for standardizing information. So disparate data can be standardized using ontologies, which are something you may already be familiar with. But as a reminder, the foundations of ontologies come from philosophy, which was this area of studying the nature of being. Ontologies have been leveraged in kind of computer science in more recent years. They are controlled vocabularies that classify information in a particular domain or area of knowledge, like diseases or phenotypes, and then define terms in both a human readable format with text definitions that define what terms mean, and then also in a computational format or machine readable format where the relationships between terms are formally defined. So you can kind of see that in this figure here where we have a particular domain of knowledge. So let's say in this case, we have diseases, and then we have these kind of hierarchical classifications of information. So you would have like different types of diseases like Mendelian diseases or infectious diseases, and then we classify information in kind of a subclass hierarchy. But then we can also use these computational logical definitions of these terms that allows for complex querying and inferencing across the data that is annotated using ontologies. So Ramona previously pointed out that important connection between the philosophical foundation of ontologies and how we make philosophical choices when we build ontologies or design ontologies, and this impacts the functionality of the ontology. Additionally, the ontologies that we choose to use is an important consideration, and that is something I will talk about. So the ontologies that we develop are part of the OBO Foundry, the Open Biological and Biomedical Foundry. This is a group of ontology developers who are committed to developing open and interoperable and scientifically accurate ontologies. And in this group of developers, we're committed to this shared set of principles that abides by these kind of guiding principles. So there's a lot of ontologies that are available in the OBO Foundry, and this is a good place to look if you're looking for ontologies that can be used. And because they're built to be interoperable with each other, it makes the data aggregation just much better when you're aggregating data together, when annotating data with different ontologies. So if you need to search for ontologies, the OBO Foundry webpage is a good place to look. And I also recommend using the ontology lookup service. This is a kind of aggregator website that contains over 200 ontologies. I think the majority of the OBO Foundry ontologies are in here. They have a very nice search interface where you can just search for specific terms or search on IDs for the ontology terms, and then it'll take you to a page where it displays the term label, the definitions. It'll show you the hierarchical classification. It'll give you information about cross-references to other ontologies and other relevant information. So you can search on individual terms, or you can restrict your searches to specific ontologies and search ontologies using this service. Other services are available too that are great to use for searching for ontology terms. So when thinking about using ontologies for annotating your data, one consideration is which ontology is the right ontology to use. So within the OBO Foundry, there's hundreds of ontologies, and the intention is to have the ontologies that are non-overlapping and represent unique areas of knowledge. However, this is not always the case, and some ontologies overlap and cover similar domains. So a particular relevance to you may be ontologies representing information about human or animal diseases and phenotypes, such as what we study in the Monarch Initiative. So one example is our group develops the Mondo disease ontology, which is an ontology for cross-species diseases, but other disease ontologies and terminologies also exist, and these have particular strengths and are designed for different purposes. So when considering which ontology to use, there's some considerations for determining which is the right ontology to use that I've outlined here on this slide. So I recommend start by selecting an appropriate ontology and then restricting your search to that ontology. So if you are going to be doing disease annotations, for example, we suggest choosing one disease ontology, such as the Mondo disease ontology, and restrict your searches to just to that ontology. We also recommend using ontologies that are open and interoperable. So the consideration of open is that those ontologies don't have licensing restrictions. They're free and open to use. You don't have to necessarily pay to be able to use them or to share your data that's been annotated with those ontologies. And considering interoperable ontologies, that just enables better interoperability and aggregation and downstream analyses of your data. So we recommend focusing on OBO Foundry ontologies because they focus on these kind of defined principles. And so, yeah, thinking about some of these considerations, make informed decisions about which ontologies to use. Also, one other consideration is using ontologies that are actively developed and have active contributors. So I'll show you later, you can look at, we have GitHub issue trackers for ontologies. These are repositories where the ontologies are stored, and just looking to see if the ontologies, how frequently the issues are responded to, if people are actively working on it. Some ontologies are created as a like a short-term project, and when funding goes away, the ontology is not really continued to be maintained. And then one important consideration is if the ontology doesn't have a term that you want, then you can make new term requests and ask for new terms to be added to ontologies. So I'm going to talk about that in the contributing to ontologies section, which explaining how you can do that. So first, before I go into how to contribute to ontologies, I want to show you some use cases from work that we've done, how we've used ontologies for standardizing and integrating data, and some downstream analysis that we've done. So this is a kind of a busy slide showing kind of what we do with the Monarch Initiative. So the Monarch Initiative, you can go to our website here, see monarchinitiative.org, and look at all the different data that we have. So in Monarch, we use ontologies and semantic standards to aggregate data and support disease diagnostics for both for common and rare diseases. And so we use this integrated data to inform diagnosis and decisions. So we use several underlying OBO Foundry biomedical ontologies to structure the various disparate data sets that we get from various sources. So you can see in panel A, we have data sources coming from a number of different sources, which include model organism databases, pathway databases, and so on. And then we collect information about different features of diseases like genes or different variants, model organisms, diseases, phenotypes, etc. And then we standardize this data using different ontology standards. Some of the data is already standardized using ontologies, some of it's not. So we standardize the data using several different ontologies. And then we also have created or use a few different integrated ontologies that are intended to aggregate these existing ontologies and standards. So one example at the top is Mondo, which I previously mentioned, the Mondo disease ontology. This is a cross-species disease ontology that integrates 17 external disease terminology resources into this one unified resource. And this is used for leveraging our disease information that's annotated from different disease terminologies. We've also created the UPheno ontology, which is the unified phenotype ontology. So this was a collective effort from a group of us who worked on different species-specific phenotype ontologies. And we came together and developed a shared set of patterns in which to define our phenotype terms in a computational format. So this now we have a unified phenotype ontology that can be used to cover phenotypic abnormalities across different species. So this is kind of a big overview of the Monarch Initiative, which is just aggregating information about model organism data in order to help inform rare disease diagnostics. So going into a little bit more detail about a specific ontology, I'll talk about the human phenotype ontology. So this gives you kind of a broader overview too of how ontologies are kind of structured and how the classification works. So the HPO is an ontology of phenotypic abnormalities encountered in human diseases. And all the terms are classified in this hierarchical classification, with the top level term being phenotypic abnormality. And then we have more specific, more granular terms classified in this kind of branch structure underneath. So for example, we have one term, hyperglycemia. This is in the abnormal metabolism and homeostasis branch of the HPO. And we use these logical axioms. These are kind of the underlying computational logic that are used to define the terms. And we integrate terms from other ontologies, speaking to the interoperability of these other ontologies that we use. So the term hyperglycemia is defined as an increased level of glucose, which is where the term glucose comes from external ontology, the chemical ontology Kebi. And where you have an increased level of glucose in the blood, which in blood being an anatomical entity from the Uberon anatomy ontology. And one other thing to point out about the HPO, I helped lead a project several years ago where we systematically went through the entirety of the HPO and tried to assign layperson synonyms to all the terms. So, so ontology terms have their primary labels like hyperglycemia, but they also have as many synonyms as need to be included. And so we systematically went through the HPO and tried to apply layperson synonyms where we could. I think we were able to cover about 60% of the HPO with layperson synonyms. So for example, a layperson synonym for hyperglycemia would be high blood sugar or high blood sugar levels. So, so how do we use these ontologies for in disease diagnostics? So, so with our ontologies that we've created, we are able to integrate data across species, especially using like the unified phenotype ontology, which is the cross-species phenotype ontology. And then using this, we are able to do this fuzzy matching kind of analysis where we are able to compare data from model organisms and variants we see in model organisms and compare them to human phenotypes, and then we can make inferences about human disease diagnostics. So I'll walk you through this figure here. So in panel A, this is just showing how we built the UPheno ontology using these template-based systems. So like I said, we had a group of ontology collaborators who came together and we agreed on these shared set of patterns where we created these templates. So we basically have kind of a prescribed way in which how we define terms in different phenotype ontologies across species, so that they're consistently the terms are created in a consistent format. So in this example, we have this zebrafish phenotype ontology and the human phenotype ontology. And then if we want to look at if we have patients that are presenting with certain phenotypes, we can compare the phenotypes in a human to the phenotypes in an animal, in this case, a zebrafish. And if we know that certain genes are implicated or certain gene variants are implicated in certain phenotypes in an animal, we can do this fuzzy matching, this phenotype fuzzy matching, and infer using our reasoner that maybe an orthologous gene in the human may impact the phenotypes in humans that we see the gene impacting it in zebrafish. And based on this phenotypic similarity analysis, we can help with gene prioritization and diagnostics in rare disease patients. So this is a really cool case that was one of our colleagues in the Monarch Initiative saw in the clinic, where he had patients come in presenting with similar phenotypes and the same variation in the same gene, or with mutations in the same gene, but not the same variant. And these patients had some similar but non-overlapping phenotypes. But we were able to use this kind of fuzzy matching phenotypic similarity analysis to diagnose these patients with the same disease. So, so in the middle column here, these are the typical phenotypic presentation seen in this syndrome called Wiedemann-Steiner syndrome. And then the patients described in the first and the last column, these are the phenotypes that these patients presented with. So in the case of the 14-year-old boy, we have this patient presenting with a long toe, but the typical presentation of the syndrome is a short toe. So this is described as a fuzzy match. But then the patient also displayed delayed speech and language development, which is a commonly seen phenotype in this syndrome. So by comparing these different phenotypic presentations to the kind of the gold standard presentation of this disease, we were able to make these fuzzy matching relationships, because we know that short toe and long toe are both children of the term abnormality of the toe. So by using this graph kind of classification, we can crawl up the graph and say, okay, this patient doesn't have the exact same phenotype, but it's in the same branch of the ontology, and therefore it's a fuzzy match. And this was enough data to be able to inform the diagnosis of these two patients who both had the same disease, even though they had different phenotypic presentations. So going on to talk about other efforts in our work, I want to describe the Mondo disease ontology. And this is a project that I lead the curation efforts on this ontology. And this is one of my favorite projects that I work on, is the development for the Mondo disease ontology. So this is an ontology describing diseases across species. It contains over 20,000 disease terms. And what's unique about Mondo as a disease ontology, it's an integrator ontology where we've taken 17 source terminologies, different ontologies and different other terminologies, and integrated these into one unified ontology. So this this picture on the left here shows you kind of some of the classifications that we have in Mondo. So in all the ontologies that we develop, we have this multiple classification where terms can be classified under multiple parents. So for example, we have this term adult Refsum disease, and this is a child of neurometabolic disease and a child of this enzyme deficiency. And then these classes are classified in multiple ways. So you get this kind of graph visualization and this graph kind of data, this graph kind of representation of these different terms. And then we also have these relationships, like I showed you kind of with HPO, where we have features of the disease encoded into the ontology. So neuropathy and leukoencephalopathy are features of this disease. And this is also encoded into the underlying logic in the ontology. Another thing that's unique about Mondo is that since it aggregates all these different terminologies into this one source, we also provide these cross-references to the external ontologies. So you can see that these terms have cross-references to the external ontologies that from which they were derived. And this is just going into a little bit more detail with the same example of adult Refsum syndrome. So like I said, ontology terms have a primary label and they also have synonyms. So to describe those terms, which helps aid with searching and retrieval of different terms and tries to address all the different terminology that one may use. So in the case of diseases, there's a lot of different descriptions of how to describe different diseases coming from different resources. So what you see in this middle column here, these are all the different external resources that have been aggregated together to create this single adult Refsum disease term. And then on the far left column, these are all the different synonyms that have ever been used to describe this term. So, and then we also track the provenance or the source of these synonyms. And then we also provide semantic mapping to the source ontologies. So if, so for example, if you were using Orphanet for your disease annotations, we note in the Mondo ontology that this Orphanet term is an exact match to the to this Mondo term. So you can just crosswalk across your data and annotate to the Mondo term should you so choose. And we also note if the term is a non-exact match, if the mapping is a non-exact match as well. One really cool thing that we've been able to do with the Mondo ontology is determine to try to count up the number of rare diseases. So the typical number that's usually published in the literature is somewhere between 5 and 8,000 rare diseases. So we did our own analysis using the Mondo ontology and counted up the number of rare diseases based on certain attributes, including if the disease was described as rare by any of the contributing resources. And we also considered any Mendelian disease, for example, those indexed with OMIM, the online Mendelian inheritance in man, which are Mendelian diseases being described as diseases caused by variants in a single gene. We also counted those as rare, and we came up with a number that was over 10,000 rare diseases. Another thing of interest was that many diseases were only in one source. So Mondo is one of the only terminologies that may be aggregating all the different rare diseases that could be, or all the diseases that could be considered rare in this world. And when we looked at 5 different terminologies at once, we only saw that 333 disease concepts were shared across in these 5 sources that we looked at. So that was kind of a really interesting result that we saw, and which helps us feel good about our work that we're doing with Mondo, because we are an aggregator of all the rare disease information. So now I want to talk to you about why you should contribute to ontologies. So hopefully I've showed you how we are able to do a lot of cool analyses and able to do a lot of great work with our efforts with annotating data with ontologies, but why should you contribute to these ontology development efforts? So it's a community effort. All the ontologies that we use for data standardization and all these analyses that we perform in Monarch, they're under constant revision and iterative development. And this is a community effort, and we need expertise from different areas. So ontologies are really, they're always built in a kind of a collaborative format. We need expertise from technical expertise, we need expertise in domain expertise, and it's really helpful to have user experiences and user feedback. So ontologies are sometimes built for specific projects, but a lot of ontologies are intended to be used by the wider community. So that anyone has access to them and anyone can contribute to them. So there's a lot of different ways which you can make contributions, and this is described here and further in the website that I mentioned earlier. So I will go into specifics now on how you can contribute to ontologies. So one of the best ways to contribute is most ontologies, and I think the majority of OBO Foundry ontologies and all the ontologies we use in Monarch for rare disease work, they're all available on GitHub, and GitHub has an issue tracker that is a place where you can report bugs, you can request new terms, you can ask for changes to the ontology, like new labels, relabel terms, or revised definitions. There's also, if you are interested, you can also edit the ontology files directly. The ontologies are openly shared and are available on GitHub. So if you know how to create branches and do pull requests, that's something that's welcome. It's really fun when we have external contributors contributing to our ontologies. And in the website I mentioned earlier, and contributor instructions, I actually link out to some instructions that are self-paced training materials on how to actually make ontology contributions by directly editing the file, should you be so interested. I also want to note that on our GitHub repositories, you can comment on tickets, or we have discussion boards too. So those are places for the community to give feedback. And a lot of the ontologies that are actively developed, and our Monarch ontologies be an example of this, we have regular recurring phone calls and Zoom calls where we usually discuss specific tasks and issues of our workflows. But if anyone's interested in joining the calls, I know I can speak from the ontologies that I work on, that we welcome community members to join us and talking about their specific use cases and requesting feedback, or you're simply welcome to just come and listen in. So like I mentioned, GitHub is a great place to be able to report issues and discuss different concerns or questions about ontologies. So if you haven't ever used GitHub before, you can sign up for free at this link, just github.com. And in my contributor materials too, I have some instructions on how to sign up and how to use GitHub and get started with using GitHub as well. So if you're not familiar with GitHub, GitHub is an online platform that's used for hosting software development projects. Originally is mostly used kind of by software developers for sharing code, but it's more routinely used by, it's really routinely used by ontology projects, and it's getting more routinely used for just for project management as well. So the ontology community generally uses GitHub to store the ontology files. So you can actually pull down the ontology files that are being developed or the release files from the GitHub repositories. It provides version control. So if you do end up wanting to contribute to the ontologies, just know that there's version control and you really can't break anything that can't be can't be reverted. And then, like I said, we have our issue tracker on GitHub. So just a little bit more detail about the ontology issue tracker. So this is a place where you can put formal ontology requests. And like I said, you can request new terms, you can request changes to the terms. You could say, this term isn't classified in the right way. I think it should be subclassed in a different way. So yeah, they've been used for a long time by the software development community for tracking bugs and feature requests. And some of the advantage of using GitHub, the repositories that we have are open and publicly available. So anyone can view what's been requested on GitHub, and you can comment just by simply signing up for their free account. You can comment on it. You don't have to be part of the project or involved at all. And it's also a nice kind of place for documentation. So a lot of times, sometimes making changes to an ontology can require a lot of time and discussion and deliberation. And you can see, and then when it's done in a public format, like on the GitHub tracker, it's a nice place where you can kind of have the documentation of the conversation that went on. And then another thing that we do often, especially in Mondo, is we link to the ontology ticket and in the actual ontology metadata. So for example, like if you go to OLS and search for a term, you might see a link to a GitHub URL. And if you click that, that'll show the conversation that happened over on the GitHub ticket, kind of describing why we made certain changes to terms. Okay, so next I'm going to show you this video, and I'm going to have to pull the screen over real fast. So this is just a screenshot or a little movie of how to request a new issue on GitHub. So when you go to the GitHub repository, this example is in Mondo, you'll see on the issue, this is the issue tracker. So if you're clicked on issues, you can click this green button for new issue. And depending on the ontology that you're using, or the GitHub repository that you're in Mondo and HPO and several trackers now have this. We have these issue templates, which I think is really helpful because it kind of gives you guide as to what to add to the term request. So if you clicked on new issue, and then you'll be taken to this template page, and then choose a template that makes most sense. And then it has some guiding information as to what kind of information that should you include about this ticket. So in this case, I'm giving an example of requesting a new term. So I put the name of the term at the top of on the top label, and then there's these guiding prompts to ask you what kind of information you want to add. So this is kind of an example of creating a good term request. Any kinds of requests on the trackers is really appreciated. So anything is encouraged. The more information that's provided, that facilitates the curation process and the editing of the ontology. So in this case, we added the new label, and then we also adding some synonyms here. And minor things to note are, like, in a lot of ontologies, the terms are always lowercase. So adding the label in a lowercase format just helps in the tiniest way. Suggesting the new parent term for the new term is really helpful. In this case, this prompt has an example definition. So this is kind of an example of the patterns that we use, where all the terms that are following this format that are kind of gene-based disease names have this kind of pattern for the disease definition. And then we add a definition source. So we always reference a source for the definition, whether it be from a clinical paper or to external ontology. If there's any children terms that you think should be, if you want to redo classifications, it's really helpful to note the children terms with the IDs for the terms or the labels. And then we also ask that you include your ORCID if you have an ORCID ID, so we can give you nano attribution for the work that you've done. And then in the case of Mondo, if you were contributing to the Mondo ontology, and some of these ontologies are set up this way, or some of the trackers are set up this way, where someone will be automatically signed, which is a nice feature of having the templates. And then with Mondo or HPO or any of the Monarch ontologies, or I would say just with any ontology in general, feel free to follow up if you have created a ticket and it's taken a long time to get a response, because a lot of these projects are spread a little bit thin, and it can take some time to get a response. So feel free to follow up with the ontology developers if you feel like too much time has gone by and you haven't received a response. Just one note about the synonyms too. When requesting new synonyms or just noting the synonyms in the different ontologies, most of the synonyms are added to an ontology as an exact match where the term has the exact same meaning as a primary label. But we also can add synonyms in different scopes where we can have more specific terms that are called narrow synonyms, more general terms that are called broad synonyms, or sometimes synonyms get added that are not quite an exact match. But they're even kind of used synonymously with the primary term in the literature or elsewhere, and the usage is not strictly correct. We can add those as related synonyms as well. And in Mondo, we sometimes will exclude or deprecate synonyms if they are synonyms that are historically not appropriate or just terms that are no longer used, but we want to keep a record of the usage of the synonym. So just keep in mind when looking at the ontology, just keep in mind what the synonym scope is. So just another note about kind of the process it takes when requesting changes to an OBO ontology. So most of these ontologies have a term tracker on GitHub. And then, so if you post an issue on GitHub, just also note that it's a publicly available, accessible source. Even if you don't have an account, you can still view GitHub. You just need an account to be able to comment or to create tickets. And then you all have the opportunity to provide community and expert advice. So if you have specialized knowledge in a certain area, it's really helpful for all of us if you can come in and provide any opinions about any changes or new terms to the ontology. And then a lot of the ontologies have these dedicated curation teams who will add the terms to the ontology and then create pull requests, which is just kind of part of the GitHub workflow. And then these are reviewed by curation teams and then added to kind of a temporary or edit file, which is not the file that's kind of under development. And then the actual ontologies are released usually on a recurring schedule. Like for example, Mondo is released on a monthly basis, or some other ontologies may be released more on an ad hoc basis if they don't have as much activity on them. And then the OLS will pick up the new terms, usually within a few days after the release. So in the final part of this talk, I just want to talk about how these ontologies, how ontologies are used in the RDCA DApp. So this figure here kind of gives an overview of the workflow of how data is added and standardized in the RDCA DApp. So you have these disparate data types like clinical trial information, genomic data, and imaging data. And then this is added to the database and then standardized using ontologies. And then the standardized data is accessible in a cloud interface that can be accessed by researchers and members of the CPAF. And then as an outcome, they can you all can take actionable rare disease drug development solutions to help advance this field. So ontologies are important for the standardization of the disparate data types, and they make the data fair. So you may be familiar with this idea of fair data that's findable, so it can be easily retrieved, it's accessible, it's interoperable. Like I said, these ontologies are built in this shared format where we adhere to these shared principles, so the data is more interoperable with each other. And then just by these facets, then it becomes more reusable. And using ontologies can enable better search, because you can search on the ontology terms themselves, and then the ontology terms have these synonyms. So you don't have to know the exact string. You can search on different synonyms, and that should retrieve the term that you're looking for, and including layperson synonyms. And this is something that we really would love to expand too. So if you have any suggestions for new layperson synonyms in any of the ontologies, that'd be a great way to contribute to the ontologies. And then using the structured data, we could do computational analyses like the semantic similarity analysis, like I showed you in Monarch, and create new hypotheses and derive new knowledge. So here's my final few slides. I have a summary slide. So today I hope that my overview of biomedical ontologies has refamiliarized you or introduced you to how ontologies are used for structuring knowledge in a specific domain, and how we can use ontologies to standardize and integrate phenotypic and genotypic data for rare diseases. And I hope that you feel the need that you can contribute to ontologies, and how your expertise and experience is really valuable to the ontology community. And I hope that you'll consider opening a GitHub account if you don't already have one, and perusing through some of the ontologies and making requests or any changes. And with that, I'd like to acknowledge my team. These are just a few of the people from the Monarch Initiative that have been critical in helping develop some of this introduction to ontologies content. And we have a ton of content available about ontologies and training and self-paced training materials at this website here. And with that, I thank you. And here's my contact information. Feel free to get in touch with me with any questions. And now we have time for our question and answer panel. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nicole, for that super informative presentation. Now we're going to move to the question and answer panel. I'm really having a hard time pronouncing today. To the question and answer panel. And just to introduce our panelists, of course, Nicole and I, you have already met. The other two panelists may be well known to many of you who have joined these webinars in the past. We have Jeff Barrett, who is a senior vice president at the Critical Path Institute and the lead of the RDCA DAP, and Alexander Betournet, who is also part of the RDCA DAP and is our scientific director. So we have some great questions that have come in the Q&A already. So I think I will start with those questions and we can kind of work through those. And then I think a few more may have come in on chat. So the first question was, well, I'll just say there was a question who someone asked if you have published the 10,000 number about the number of rare diseases. And so I shared a link with them to the how many diseases are there paper. Yeah. So others know that that's in the Q&A panel if you're interested in seeing that. So the first question was, from Laura Yobes, can you talk more about the distinction between the way Mondo is integrated into one source and the other ontologies would seem like they may be sort of more side-by-side comparison?
So the Mondo ontology, so I guess if I could compare just like HPO to Mondo. So HPO is an ontology that was built just by creating an ontology. I think they initially mined phenotypes that were described in OMIM, the online Mendelian inheritance of man. And that was an initial seed for the human phenotype ontology, just any phenotypic description in there. And then it's been developed just as a single resource with a lot of community input, with community requests on the tracker. And Peter Robinson, who's the lead of the HPO and the creator, he does a lot of focused groups with different experts in different medical fields. Like we just did like a prenatal phenotype session where we gathered together prenatal clinicians and asked them what kinds of phenotypes are you missing in here and how should we add them with Mondo. And so it's just kind of iteratively developed and continually added to. With Mondo, we took the 17 source ontologies that we used to create Mondo, and they were aggregated together using an algorithmic approach, which was done by Chris Mungle, who's one of the ontology engineers in our group and kind of one of the lead ontology people in the community. And he used this algorithm called K-Boom to compare the diseases to each other and make these kind of probabilistic assumptions about if the terms should be equivalent to each other or if they should be arranged in the hierarchy in certain ways. And then from there, we've kind of iteratively review the terms. And we also get a lot of community input on that because we end up with 20,000 terms. We haven't been able to look at each term individually, but we get a lot of input from the community saying, okay, this mapping is incorrect and can you please fix it? Or as we come across it, we fix it ourselves. And we did a lot of initial review. But yeah, so I'd say Mondo is kind of unusual and that it's a kind of this integrated resource, also like Uberon. But a lot of other ontologies are kind of built just from the ground up with taking the domain and initially seeking the information and then kind of allowing the community to come in and improve it over time.
I think that's a great question with a great answer to a really important question. And it points out how, excuse me, how the diversity of ontologies that are out there, and each one is built for different purposes. And so you really need to understand not only what your needs are, but why the ontology was built when you're choosing which ones to use. Our next question. Sorry, go ahead, Alex.
Sorry, no, actually, I had a question related to that.
Okay.
With different ontology efforts, different applications. Can we think about heading toward one unique global ontology system worldwide? I know the answer. It is wishful thinking, but I guess maybe like comment on how do you navigate, different ontology system, different efforts. I think you touched about some, direct input that people can make on developing ontologies. So just maybe comment on that.
Yeah. I mean, some applications do build application-specific ontologies where they'll build an ontology that's based just for the kind of the database or the application that they're doing. When I first started working in this field, I worked for the Eagle Eye Network, which was it was a network of repositories that aggregated information about reagents and resources in labs. And we created a specific ontology just for that. That was driving the database interface, and also we had specific terms that we added that were just needed for that database. But we also aggregated existing ontologies like OBI, which is the Open Biomedical Investigations ontology, and we use like NCBI taxon for description of organisms. So sometimes people will build an application-specific ontology that's used just to drive a specific database, but it's generally, at least in the OBO Foundry world, they recommend using the OBO Foundry ontologies, and the fact that they're built to be interoperable with each other enables them to be kind of used in different pieces. So you could have an ontology that covers everything that you need in a specific domain, but then we also encourage reuse of the existing ontologies. So if you had an application-specific ontology, we'd discourage you from building your own phenotype descriptions. We'd want you to use the HPO ontology, and then if anything's missing, then we'd say, please come to our GitHub and request new terms. And if you disagree with the way we've classified things, then please let us know. And maybe we're wrong. No one ever is insisting on things being done a certain way, and we're always open to community feedback.
Yeah, and Alex, I would say that, one of the goals of the OBO Foundry is to build an ontology system that covers the majority of biological and biomedical applications. But there's also a realist recognition that there will always be other use cases out there, and that it may be wishful thinking that there's going to be one system. I feel that I have to say that I think that what the Monarch Initiative has done through their work with Mondo and Ufino, where they've been able to harmonize multiple ontologies, is probably the closest anyone has come to having a single system that incorporates the diversity of biological vocabularies and ontologies that are out there, which is why we're so happy to have Nicole here speaking about it today. We have lots more questions in the Q&A panel. Let's see. We have one from Benjamin Helm that says the value of linking clinical data to ontological terms codes is huge. Jumping around, sorry. However, in my experience suggests that many EMR or electronic medical record tools are limited, and clinicians have limited ability to systematically collect and log ontological codes on a per patient basis. I would agree with that observation. Any advice on designing clinical registries and variables that clinicians can use or would be willing to use, or would you be willing to meet with me? He says in parentheses.
Yes, I'd absolutely be willing to meet with you. It'd probably be great to get other members of my team as well. This is something that we've thought about a lot, particularly other members of my team, like our PIs, like Melissa Handel and Peter Robinson. I know that Peter's met with folks about trying to get HPO into electronic medical records. a couple of things I can think of off the top of my head are one effort by Tiffany Callahan, who just recently graduated from the University of Colorado. She did this project as part of her thesis called OMOP to OBO, where she encoded all the OMOP variables to ontology terms. So that kind of provides a bridge between the EHRs and then the OBO ontologies. As well, I did a project with Peter Robinson at the HPO where we encoded link codes, the laboratory test codes to phenotypic terms. And we have a library available with that, and further work is being done on that right now. So our group has done some work on trying to kind of bridge this gap between the electronic health records and the ontology codes. I think with regard to just getting it more into the clinic, it's a hard problem. We actually just met with some folks at the University of Colorado Children's Hospital recently that were kind of facing the same problem, saying that, you know, in the clinic, there's so much documentation to be done just for the insurance and billing purposes that it's a big ask to ask the clinicians to go in and try to code things in phenotype terms too. So it's a problem. It's a big problem. It's a known problem. But yeah, I'd be happy to meet with you to discuss further, and we can invite other members of my team who have more experience with this too.
Yeah, that I CPATH would love to help facilitate such a meeting if possible as well.
Yeah, that'd be great.
This is an area that we're really interested in as well.
Yeah.
Great. We have actually another super interesting question from Laura Yobes about what role patients can play in patients with rare diseases can play in contributing. Should that be indirectly or direct, or are there direct ways for them to get involved in the community?
Yeah, that's a great question. Another thing that we definitely would love to be able to address. But one of the efforts with creating the layperson terminology was kind of an effort to try to make the ontologies more accessible to lay people. And a follow-up project after we created the layperson terminology and synonyms at HPO, we actually did a project where we had a survey that went out to patients and trying to collect their own phenotype information and then comparing if the layperson terminology enhanced their responses to the survey versus if not. And that's a paper that's under development and should be coming out sometime in the near future. But yeah, it'd be great if we could get more standardized information into the patient registries and have ways that patients can share their information. Another project that Melissa and Peter and my group developed is called Phenopackets, where people can, this is now being used as a standard for collecting phenotype information, and they should have the layperson terms in them too. So yeah, integrating some of these tools that we have like Phenopackets into patient types of registries would be really helpful.
And I was thinking, I know of a couple of community-driven boards and websites for rare disease patients where they communicate, discuss with each other, describe their symptoms, and some of these companies that have these boards are trying to extract information to describe, what the patient experience and how they describe their symptoms. And yeah, I can see maybe some applications there or project that could be developed to apply ontologies to what the patients are describing on these boards.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the Phenopacket standard is meant to be kind of a structured standard for sharing this kind of information. So if those could get integrated into these kinds of discussion boards in some way, that would be really great.
Yeah, and I think it's important for people to recognize they may have heard of the Phenopacket and think that because it comes from the Global Alliance for Genomes and Health, if they're not doing genomic data, that it's something that they can't use, but that's not the case. Phenopackets really are describing phenotypes, and you don't need to have associated genomic information to go along with them.
Yeah.
Jeff, we're running. We got about 5 minutes left on the panel. Jeff, I wanted to give you a chance to have your question before we run out of time.
Yeah, I think I would focus it on the panelists, not the panelists, okay. the audience questions.
Okay, great. So we have one from Jane Paulson. I think partially that was answered about facilitating experts in specific diseases getting involved, but she's also asked how this work is funded. So she says this is really important, and how is it funded? This is a constant question.
Yeah. Well, our work is funded by various NIH grants. So we have it's an NHGRI grant called Phenomics First, which is funding the work that I do on Mondo, and other community. With that particular grant, it's to extend the work on Mondo and also to kind of create more of a community amongst the Mondo users. So holding workshops and getting more involved with our users. And we also have some other aims that are to enhance UFino and to work on other aspects. Yeah, Monarch is funded through an NCATS grant. So all the grants that we currently have, I believe, are all through the NIH. So different mechanisms, a lot through the Office of the Director and other mechanisms. Yeah. And
so many questions, and I don't know, well, I'll see how many, if we can get through a couple more. Ian Winward asks, are ontologies ever derived mathematically, specifically outside of associations through statistical analysis?
that I do not know. That is beyond my expertise. Do you know the answer to that, Ramona?
I would say that there, the types of ontologies that Nicole and I work on are really built to encode human knowledge into a machine readable format. So primarily they are built by humans. There are definitely, there's a lot of work going on to develop methods for trying to automate ontology building using things like artificial intelligence or natural language processing, but they still usually require a human in the loop at some point. There may be mathematical ontology development outside of biology, but I'm not aware of any sort of mathematical algorithmic development for biomedical ontologies. Although, as you pointed out, for the associations, there are definitely mathematical models that are used to establish the association between, for example, an ontology term and a gene or a gene expression. So this is a great question from Richard Lusky. What is the fundamental difference between an ontology and a data standard like CDISC or FHIR?
I'm not super familiar with FHIR. I know that's like a standard for how to capture information in electronic.
Sorry, I should spell that out. CDISC is the Clinical Data Interchange Standards Consortium, I believe, and FHIR is the Fast Health Interoperability Resource, which is developing APIs, particularly for sharing health data among different electronic medical record sources.
Yeah, so those are data models on how to model disease, and then ontologies are kind of a classification of specific terminologies. Mm-hmm. So the ontologies are more terminologies, and the CDISC and FHIR are just the models on how to capture the information.
That's right. So there's definitely the possibility to use ontologies in conjunction with standards. So for example, CDISC in their study data tabulation model uses the National Cancer Institute thesaurus for many of their controlled vocabularies. So you might have a standard like SDTM that says you have to put the data in this particular format and you have to ask these particular questions. So your column headers, as it were, and then the values within each column would be drawn from an ontology. So that's the way that the two different pieces can work together.
Ramona, I just want to make a point here because I think this is really a key distinction, because one of the benefits of RDC-DEP is that the ontologies are really functional and they help us really understand disease types and find data, as well as to discriminate and classify patients. Mm-hmm. We can always translate individual data types to certain standards that would be suitable for regulatory submission, making sure that sponsors get what they need when they're using the platform to file, but also we have a more, let's just say, functional anchor from which to do analysis.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that's a really, really important point, Jeff. I'm really glad you brought that up. In our last 2 minutes, I'm sorry for those of you that have asked questions that we're not going to get to, and they seem to be jumping around on my screen, so I'm not always able to go in order that the questions were asked. I'm gonna bring up one more question from Gully Burns, and then we're going to have to probably cut it off there. Gully asks, in some rare diseases that are unstudied, patient organizations have a unique perspective on phenotypes for their diseases. Would it be possible for patients to help model the phenotype representations for these diseases? I think Nicole, we can all end with a resounding yes, please.
Absolutely. Yes, that'd be amazing. Yeah, we would love to have the input directly from the patients themselves. And like I said, like for phenotype classification, we've had a lot of focus meetings that just get together experts in certain areas. So getting the patients themselves, they are the best experts to understand their phenotype. So it would be really wonderful to do that. We'd love to have that for HPO or for any of the phenotype ontologies.
Yeah. So thank you again, Nicole, for that outstanding presentation. Thank you to our audience for so many thoughtful questions. We will be reaching out via email with answers to questions that came up that we did not have time to address in this panel. And if for those of you who are interested in getting involved, please do feel free to get in contact with myself, Jeff, Alex, or Nicole, or anyone on the RDCA DAP team, and we're happy to work with you.
And these are great questions. Thank you all for coming.
Mhm.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.